I always thought betrayal was something that happened to other people. You hear the stories, friends of friends, late-night confessions over a beer, or cautionary tales in movies. But when it's your reality, it hits you like a freight train. My name is Michael, and until 6 months ago, I was just an ordinary guy living an ordinary life. My wife, Sarah, and I had been married for 10 years. She was the love of my life, or so I believed. I trusted her completely, too completely, as it turns out. It all started when Sarah began working late. At first, I didn't think much of it. Deadlines, demanding bosses, these things happen. But then the excuses started piling up. Business trips that didn't match up with her schedule. Text messages she would hide, laughing nervously when I asked about them. And then there were the phone calls, always answered in a low, hushed tone. I decided to follow her. It was a Friday night, and Sarah had told me she'd be working late again. She kissed me on the cheek before she left, her lipstick leaving a faint smudge on my skin. "I'll probably be back by midnight," she said. I watched her leave, waited 10 minutes, and then got into my car. It wasn't hard to track her. She wasn't expecting to be followed, and her predictable route to the office made it easy. But when I saw her car pull into the parking lot of a hotel instead of her workplace, my heart sank. I parked a safe distance away and waited, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard they turned white. After about 15 minutes, I saw her step out of her car. She wasn't alone. Paul. He met her by the entrance, his hand brushing her lower back as they walked inside. I sat there for an hour, trying to convince myself to leave, to go home, to pretend I hadn't seen what I'd just seen. But I couldn't. The next day, while Sarah was in the shower, I snooped through her phone for the first time in our marriage. My hands shook as I scrolled through her messages. She was careful, most of her texts with Paul were deleted, but I found enough to confirm my worst fears. There was a string of messages in her trash folder, including one from Paul that read, "Last night was incredible. Can't wait to see you again tonight." My stomach churned as I read her reply, "I feel so alive when I'm with you. It's like I can finally breathe." Finally breathe? What did that make me, suffocating? I couldn't confront her yet. Not without a plan. The night I saw Megan in the parking lot, I realized I wasn't the only one living this nightmare. She was sitting in her car, her face pale as she watched Paul and Sarah walk hand in hand back to their cars. For a moment, our eyes met. There was a flicker of recognition, shared pain, shared betrayal. She looked away quickly, starting her car and pulling out of the lot. I should have gone after her, but I didn't. Instead, I went home and stared at the ceiling all night, wondering how the woman I loved could look at me every day and lie so easily. The next morning, I found her online. Megan Whitman, Paul's wife. Her Facebook profile was private, but her Instagram wasn't. Through her posts, I saw a life that mirrored mine, vacations, anniversaries, pictures of her kids with captions like, "So proud of our little family." I sent her a message, "Hi Megan. My name is Michael, and I'm Sarah's husband. I think we need to talk." When Megan and I met at the cafe 2 days later, the air between us was heavy with unspoken pain. She arrived first, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. "Michael," she said as I slid into the seat across from her. "Megan," I replied. "Thanks for meeting me." She nodded, her hands folded tightly on the table. "So, how long have you known?" "About a month," I admitted. "You?" "6 months," she said, her voice flat. I thought I could handle it, that it would pass. But it's not stopping. I told her everything, what I'd seen, what I'd found on Sarah's phone. In return, she showed me a folder of evidence she'd compiled, screenshots of texts, photos of hotel bills, even a calendar where she'd marked all the nights Paul claimed to be working late. They think they're untouchable, Megan said, her jaw clenched. Like we're too weak to fight back. They're wrong, I said. Megan and I spent the next week strategizing. Confronting them together was step one. But we both knew that wouldn't be enough. They needed to face real consequences. I started documenting everything. I set up a hidden camera in the car Sarah and I shared, knowing she often called Paul during her drives. Meanwhile, Megan hired a private investigator to follow Paul and Sarah on their next business trip. The photos he provided were damning: Sarah and Paul embracing in the hotel lobby, kissing in the parking lot, even entering the same room late at night. Megan handed me the file at our next meeting. "This should do it," she said, her voice cold. "Let's ruin them," I replied. Sarah and Paul had no idea what was coming. Megan and I timed our entrance perfectly, walking into the restaurant just as Sarah was laughing at something Paul had said. The moment she saw me, her face went white. "Michael," she stammered. "What are you?" "Don't," I interrupted, sliding into the booth. Megan stood beside me, her arms crossed. Paul froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. "Megan, this isn't." "Shut up," Megan snapped, her voice sharp. For the next 10 minutes, we tore them apart. Every lie, every betrayal, every moment of humiliation, we laid it all out for the world to hear. By the time we left, Sarah was in tears, and Paul was stammering excuses no one believed. The aftermath was brutal. Sarah tried to deny everything at first, but the evidence was undeniable. I filed for divorce the next day, changing the locks on the house and packing her belongings into boxes. But the real fallout came when I sent the file of evidence to Paul's company. Within a week, he was fired, and Sarah was demoted. I thought that would be the end of it. But I was wrong. A week after the confrontation, I found a note taped to my front door. "Stay out of this, or you'll regret it." I called Megan immediately, and she told me she'd received a similar note. "They're desperate," she said. "We can't let them intimidate us." But the threats didn't stop. One night, I came home to find the windows of my car smashed. Another time, Megan's kids were followed home from school by a black SUV. It was clear this wasn't over. Megan and I grew closer through the chaos. What started as mutual support became something deeper, something we didn't expect. But as our relationship blossomed, the danger grew. Paul and Sarah weren't just angry, they were dangerous. The night everything changed, Megan and I were having dinner at her house when the power suddenly went out. Moments later, we heard the sound of glass shattering. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new crazy stories. The darkness was suffocating, amplifying every sound around us. Megan and I froze at the dining table, the faint echo of shattered glass coming from the living room. My pulse raced as I instinctively reached for my phone, but it was useless. No power meant no Wi-Fi, and my signal was dead. Megan whispered, her voice shaking, "They're here." I didn't need to ask who she meant. We both knew Paul and Sarah had taken things too far, but this? Breaking into Megan's home was a new level of insanity. "Stay behind me," I said, pulling her close as I grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter. We moved slowly toward the living room, the faint glow of the moon filtering through the broken window. Shards of glass glittered on the carpet like jagged stars. For a moment, the house was eerily silent, save for the sound of our breathing. And then we heard it, a creak from the hallway. I tightened my grip on the knife, my hands trembling. Megan clung to my arm, her breath shallow and panicked. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. No response. Another creak. This time closer. "Megan," a voice called out, low and familiar. It sent a chill down my spine. "Paul," Megan whispered, her face pale. I stepped forward, my heart hammering in my chest. "Paul, get out of here. I'm warning you." His laugh echoed down the hallway, a cold, mocking sound. Warning me? That's cute, Michael. You think you can protect her? I glanced at Megan, who was visibly shaking. Go to the kids' room, I whispered. Lock the door. No, she said, her voice trembling. I'm not leaving you. Before I could argue, Paul emerged from the shadows, his face illuminated by the faint moonlight. He looked unhinged, his hair disheveled and his eyes wild. You've taken everything from me, he said, his voice low and menacing. My job, my wife. You think I'm just going to let you walk away? I took a step forward, keeping the knife between us. You did this to yourself, Paul. Get out of here before things get worse. Worse, he sneered, stepping closer. Oh, Michael, you have no idea what worse looks like. Suddenly, he lunged. I barely had time to react, swinging the knife wildly. It caught his arm, and he hissed in pain, stumbling back. But he wasn't alone. From behind, another figure appeared, Sarah. She grabbed Megan by the hair, dragging her backward with a terrifying speed. Megan screamed, clawing at Sarah's hands, but she was no match for her. Let her go. I shouted, rushing toward them. Paul intercepted me, tackling me to the ground. The knife skidded out of my hand as we wrestled, his fists slamming into me with a fury I'd never seen before. Michael! Megan screamed, her voice filled with terror. I managed to push Paul off me, scrambling to my feet. Megan and Sarah were struggling near the broken window, the glass crunching beneath their feet. Without thinking, I lunged at Sarah, grabbing her arm and yanking her away. She stumbled, losing her grip on Megan, but not before grabbing a shard of glass from the window frame. You think you're better than me, she hissed, her face twisted in rage. You think you can just replace me? Before I could respond, Sarah swung the glass shard toward me. I ducked, narrowly avoiding the jagged edge, and shoved her back. She hit the wall with a thud, groaning as she crumpled to the floor. Paul was back on his feet, his face twisted with rage. You're going to regret this, he snarled, charging at me again. But this time, Megan stepped in. She grabbed a heavy vase from the table and swung it with all her strength, smashing it against Paul's head. He collapsed to the floor, groaning in pain. Megan, the kids! I shouted, pulling her toward the hallway. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded, running toward their room. I turned back to Paul and Sarah, who were both struggling to get up. I knew we didn't have much time. You need to leave, I said, my voice shaking. The police are on their way. It was a lie, but I hoped it would buy us time. Sarah laughed bitterly, blood trickling from her lip. This isn't over, Michael. You think you can take everything from us and walk away? You're going to pay for this. Paul groaned, clutching his head as he stumbled to his feet. Let's go, Sarah, he muttered. We'll deal with them later. To my relief, they staggered out the door, disappearing into the night. The police arrived shortly after, taking statements from both Megan and me. The officers were skeptical at first, but the evidence of the break-in was undeniable. I'll file a restraining order first thing tomorrow, Megan said, her voice trembling. Good idea, one of the officers replied. But be careful. People like this don't always respect boundaries. That night, as the kids slept in their room, Megan and I sat together on the couch, trying to make sense of what had just happened. This is my fault, she said quietly. If I had left Paul months ago, none of this would have happened. This isn't your fault, I replied, taking her hand. They made their choices. We just have to make sure they don't get another chance to hurt us. But it wasn't over. A week later, I found another note taped to my car windshield. This one was different from the others, it was more specific, more personal. You think you've won, Michael? Think again. Watch your back. That same day, Megan called me, her voice shaking. "There's someone outside the house," she whispered. I raced over, my heart pounding. But by the time I arrived, the figure was gone, leaving only a sense of dread behind. It was clear Paul and Sarah weren't finished with us. And this time, they weren't just after revenge. And you are on the side of Paul or Michael, write in the comments. The uneasy calm that followed the break-in didn't last long. The notes, the stalking, the shadows lurking outside Megan's home, it all felt like the beginning of something far worse. Paul and Sarah had crossed a line, and they weren't done yet. That morning, as I sat in my car outside work, rereading the latest thread on my windshield, a sinking feeling washed over me. It wasn't just about revenge for Paul and Sarah anymore. This was personal. Megan called me just before lunch. Her voice was quiet, trembling with fear. "They were here again," she whispered. "Who?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Paul and Sarah. I saw them standing outside, just staring at the house. They didn't even try to come in this time. They just stood there, watching." I clenched the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. "Did you call the police?" "I did. By the time they got here, Paul and Sarah were gone. The officers said they couldn't do much since they didn't technically do anything illegal." "Of course they didn't," I muttered bitterly. "They're trying to rattle us. They want us to feel like we're not safe." "Well, it's working," Megan admitted, her voice breaking. "We'll figure this out," I said firmly. "We'll find a way to stop them." But even as I said the words, I wasn't sure if I believed them. The escalation came 2 days later. Megan and I had decided to meet at a diner halfway between our homes to discuss our next steps. She brought the kids along, figuring they'd be safer in public than at home. Halfway through dinner, Megan's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, and her face went pale. "What is it?" I asked, my stomach sinking. She handed me the phone without a word. On the screen was a photo, her youngest son's bicycle, smashed to pieces in the middle of her driveway. The text below it read, "Next time, it won't be a bike." Megan clapped a hand over her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Her sons looked up at her, confused and worried. "What's wrong, Mommy?" her oldest asked. I quickly put the phone away and forced a smile. "Nothing, buddy. Everything's fine." But everything wasn't fine. I decided it was time to confront Paul and Sarah directly. Megan begged me not to, but I couldn't sit back and wait for them to strike again. I waited outside Paul's apartment that night, watching as the lights flickered on in the living room. When I was sure he was home, I walked up to the door and knocked, my fists trembling with anger. Paul answered, his smirk infuriatingly familiar. "Michael," he said, feigning surprise. "What a pleasant surprise." "Cut the crap, Paul," I snapped. "This ends now." "Does it?" he asked, leaning casually against the doorframe. "Because from where I'm standing, it's just getting started." Before I could respond, Sarah appeared behind him, her smile just as cold and calculating as his. "Oh, Michael," she said sweetly. "Still playing the hero, I see." "Stay away from Megan and the kids," I growled. "If you come near them again, I'll make sure you regret it." Paul's smile faded, his eyes narrowing. "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise," I said. For a moment, the tension was so thick I could barely breathe. Then Paul stepped back, his smile returning. "You've made your point, Michael. We'll see ourselves out of your little love triangle. For now." I didn't trust him, but I had no choice but to walk away. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, wondering if I'd made a mistake. Paul and Sarah weren't the kind of people who back down easily. The call came at 3 a.m. Megan's voice was frantic, barely coherent. "Michael, they set the house on fire. My heart stopped. What? Are you okay? Are the boys okay? We're fine, she sobbed. We got out in time, but... Michael, the house is gone. I drove to Megan's neighborhood, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. When I arrived, the scene was like something out of a nightmare. Flames still licked at the charred remains of the house as firefighters worked to extinguish the blaze. Megan stood on the sidewalk with her boys, wrapped in blankets, their faces streaked with soot and tears. I ran to her, pulling her into my arms. "We'll get through this," I whispered. "I promise." But as I looked at the smoldering ruins of her home, I couldn't ignore the gnawing fear in my gut. Paul and Sarah weren't just playing games anymore. They were trying to destroy us. 2 days after the fire, Megan received a visit from the police. Paul and Sarah had filed a restraining order against her, claiming she had been harassing them. "This is insane," she said, pacing the living room of my apartment, where she and the boys had been staying. "They're the ones stalking us, and now they're playing the victims?" "It's classic manipulation," I said. "They're trying to discredit us, make us look like the aggressors." "And it's working," she said bitterly. The officer didn't seem convinced when I told him about the threats. "Without proof, it's their word against ours." "We'll get proof," I said firmly. "They've slipped up before, and they'll do it again." Megan and I decided to set a trap. We installed security cameras around my apartment, hoping to catch Paul and Sarah in the act. For days, nothing happened. But on the 5th night, I woke to the sound of movement outside the window. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the living room, my heart pounding. Through the blinds, I saw them, Paul and Sarah, standing by my car, spray paint cans in hand. They were scrawling obscenities across the windows and slashing the tires, laughing as they worked. I hit record on my phone, capturing every second of their vandalism. When I was sure I had enough, I stepped outside, holding the camera high. "Smile," I said coldly. They froze, their faces pale in the harsh light of the flashlight. "This is harassment," Paul said, trying to sound confident. "This is evidence," I shot back. "And I can't wait to show it to the police." The footage was enough to get Paul and Sarah arrested for harassment and vandalism. For the first time in months, Megan and I felt a glimmer of hope. But that hope was short-lived. A week after their arrest, I received another note. This one wasn't a threat, it was a promise. "You think this is over? We're just getting started." The threat after Paul and Sarah's arrest wasn't just words. It was a harbinger of the nightmare to come. Megan and I clung to the illusion of safety for a few days, thinking the worst was behind us. But we were wrong. Paul and Sarah weren't done, and their revenge wasn't just about humiliation anymore, it was about destruction. It started subtly. Megan and I were trying to rebuild our lives, focusing on finding a new home for her and the boys. Then, strange things began to happen. One morning, as I was leaving for work, I noticed deep scratches gouged into the side of my car. At first, I thought it was random vandalism. But the note taped to the windshield said otherwise. "You'll never outrun us." That same day, Megan's boys came home from school shaken and pale. When Megan asked them what was wrong, her youngest said, "A man at the playground told us Mommy and Michael were bad people." Our blood ran cold. They were going after the kids now. I knew this wasn't just about fear anymore. Paul and Sarah wanted to tear our lives apart, piece by piece. One evening, Megan was late coming home from work. At first, I figured she was stuck in traffic. But an hour passed, then 2. She wasn't answering her phone. Panic set in. I called her boss, her coworkers, even the daycare center for her boys, nothing. No one had seen her. Finally, around midnight, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "We have her." If you call the police, you'll never see her again. My stomach dropped. I dialed her number again, my hands trembling. No answer. The next text came almost immediately, "Don't call her again." I couldn't sit still. I wanted to call the police, but the threat was too real. Instead, I paced the apartment, waiting for a follow-up message, a demand, anything. When the next message finally came, it chilled me to the core. Bring $50,000 to the abandoned mill outside town. Come alone. Midnight tomorrow. What would you do in my place? Write in the comments. The next night, I drove to the old mill, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't have $50,000, but I had a plan. I'd stashed a voice recorder in my jacket and brought a hidden camera rigged to my car. It was a desperate attempt to gather evidence that could help me later. The mill was exactly as I expected, dark, decrepit, and utterly silent. I stepped inside, calling out into the shadows. Paul. Sarah. I'm here. Where is she? A figure emerged from the darkness. It was Sarah, her face twisted into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Michael, she said sweetly. So good of you to come. Where is Megan? I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady. She's fine, Sarah said, circling me slowly. For now. Paul appeared next, dragging Megan into view. Her hands were tied, her mouth gagged. Her eyes were wide with terror. Let her go, I said, my voice shaking with rage. Paul chuckled. Oh, we'll let her go. But first, you're going to pay for what you've done. Paul raised his phone, playing a recording of my voice from one of my many arguments with Sarah. In it, I was shouting about her affair, my voice filled with fury. Doesn't sound very stable, does it? Paul said, smirking. Now imagine what the police would think if something tragic happened tonight. I realized with dawning horror what they were planning. They weren't just going to hurt Megan, they were going to frame me for it. You won't get away with this, I said, stepping closer. Paul's smile widened. We already have. In that moment, I knew I had to act. I lunged at Paul, tackling him to the ground. The struggle was chaotic, a blur of fists and shouting. Sarah screamed, scrambling to pull Megan away. In the chaos, I heard a deafening crack. For a moment, everything froze. Paul staggered back, clutching his stomach. Blood seeped through his shirt as he collapsed to the ground. I turned to see Megan holding a gun, her hands shaking violently. Her gag had slipped off during the struggle, and her eyes were filled with tears. I didn't mean to, she stammered, her voice breaking. Sarah screamed, dropping to her knees beside Paul. You'll pay for this, she hissed, her voice venomous. I grabbed Megan's arm, pulling her to her feet. We need to go. Now. We stumbled out of the mill and into the night, my car barely visible in the distance. But Sarah wasn't far behind. She emerged from the mill, her face twisted in rage. She had Paul's phone in her hand, recording as she screamed, "You're murderers. You killed him." She was building her case, trying to spin the story before we could. I didn't stop to argue. I shoved Megan into the car and slammed the door, my hands trembling as I started the engine. Sarah was still shouting as we sped away. The police arrived at my apartment the next morning. Sarah had gone straight to the station, presenting her video as evidence. She's claiming self-defense, the officer said, his expression unreadable. But you're both persons of interest. Megan and I told them everything, the threats, the break-in, the kidnapping. But without concrete proof, it was our word against Sarah's. And then came the twist. As the officers prepared to take us in for questioning, one of them received a call. Paul was alive. Paul's survival was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it meant the murder charge wouldn't stick. But on the other hand, it gave him and Sarah more power to twist the narrative. Paul claimed that Megan had tried to kill him in a jealous rage, and Sarah corroborated his story. For weeks, Megan and I lived under a cloud of suspicion, our lives reduced to courtroom appearances and lawyer meetings. The final confrontation came in a hospital room. Paul, still recovering from his injuries, smirked as Megan and I entered. "This could all go away," he said. "If you just disappear." I clenched my fists, struggling to contain my anger. "You can't keep doing this. You've already lost." "Have I?" Paul said, his smile widening. "Because last I checked, you're the ones on trial here." In the end, it wasn't me or Megan who brought Paul and Sarah down. It was their own arrogance. During one of the court hearings, Sarah accidentally revealed details about the mill and the kidnapping, details she couldn't have known unless she had been there. The police launched an investigation, uncovering the mountain of evidence Megan and I had collected. Paul and Sarah were arrested for conspiracy, kidnapping, and attempted murder. But the victory felt hollow. The scars they left on our lives were permanent, and the love Megan and I had found was forever tainted by the darkness we'd endured. In the end, we parted ways, unable to move forward together. The story didn't end with happiness, just survival. And sometimes, that's all you can hope for.